Everyone knows the zebra is the one large animal that refuses to be broken. In 1898, a man drove a carriage pulled by harnessed zebras through the streets of London up to the gates of Buckingham Palace and halted them there in front of a crowd. His name was Walter Rothschild. He came from the banking family. He cared far more about animals than about money, and he built the Zoological Museum at Tring that still holds his collection today. London had told him zebras could not be driven, so he hired a horse trainer, worked several of his zebras into harness, and took them through the city to make the point in the least deniable way available to him. The photographs survive. They come with an honest complication, which the Natural History Museum notes in its own description of the turnout. The team in the famous picture appears to include a horse dressed to match the zebras, and accounts differ over whether he drove 4 animals or 6. Still, he drove them, and he was not the only one, which is where the usual version of this story starts to come apart. Zebras have been tamed many times. In the 1760s, the French naturalist Buffon argued that zebras could simply replace horses, and the idea kept resurfacing for the next 150 years. Photographs from German East Africa around 1910 show colonial officers on the backs of zebras. There are pictures of zebra carts in Kenya in the early 1900s, of zebras harnessed alongside mules, of zebras pulling traps down suburban English streets. People crossed them with horses and with donkeys, and gave the offspring names. One of the better stories belongs to Rosendo Ribeiro, a doctor from Goa who arrived on the East African coast in 1889 and became the first private physician in Nairobi. He is remembered locally for 2 things. He was the first to identify bubonic plague in the country, and he made his house calls riding a zebra he had tamed himself. A man with a medical bag on a zebra, going door to door in a town that barely existed yet. The quagga went further than that. It was a plains zebra of the Southern Cape, brown at the back end with the stripes fading out toward the hindquarters, and reports from the 1830s describe quaggas working in harness on London streets. Dutch settlers in southern Africa shot them steadily because they ate grass the settlers wanted for cattle and sheep. The last wild ones were gone by about 1878. A single mare lived on in the Amsterdam Zoo until the 12th of August, 1883. And when she died, the zoo rode away for a replacement, not yet understanding that there was nobody to write to. 23 skins survive. 2 photographs. European zoos had held quaggas for decades by then and had never managed to breed them in numbers, which is the first hard clue about where the real obstacle sits. And yet, there is no such thing as a domestic zebra. Not one breed, not one working herd. Nowhere on earth is there a population of zebras that has been bred by people, for people, long enough to have become something different from the animals on the plains. That gap is the whole subject here, and it only makes sense once 2 words are pulled apart. Taming is something that happens to an individual animal inside a single lifetime. You take one zebra, you handle it from a young age, you teach it that people are not predators, and if you are patient and lucky, you end up with an animal that will accept a harness. Nothing about that transfers to its foals. Domestication is a change in a population carried in the genes, produced by generations of controlled breeding in which people decide who gets to reproduce. A tamed animal is a truce with one individual. A domesticated animal is an inheritance. So the question is not whether a zebra can be led. It is why the truce never turned into an inheritance. There is a second assumption worth killing before going further, because it sits underneath a lot of writing on this subject. The idea that the people of Africa simply never domesticated large animals. They did. The donkey is African, start to finish. In 2022, a team led by researchers at the Center for Anthropobiology and Genomics in Toulouse published a study in Science that assembled genomes from more than 200 living donkeys, 31 ancient ones, and 15 wild equids. The pattern in that data points to a single domestication event in Eastern Africa around 5000 BC. Not the Near East, not Central Asia, the Horn of Africa, and the region around modern Kenya, from the African wild ass, roughly 3,000 years before anyone climbed onto a horse. The timing lines up with the drying of the Sahara, when grass turned to sand and moving goods across long, dry distances became the central problem of life in that part of the world. Picture what that looked like. A shrinking water source in the Horn of Africa, 7,000 years ago, ringed by camps that have to keep moving. Wild asses come down to drink because they have nowhere else to go, and the herders are already there. Most of the animals will not tolerate the distance. A few will. Those few stay near the camps. A foal is raised among people rather than caught as an adult, and the whole slow business repeats for enough generations that the animals coming to the water are no longer quite the animals that came before. That reconstruction is built from genetics and climate records, not from anyone's eyewitness account, and it should be read that way. The bones agree with the genetics, and they show the process caught halfway. Beside a royal burial enclosure at Abydos in Egypt, dating to around 3000 BC, archaeologists found the skeletons of 10 donkeys laid out in their own graves, buried with the care usually reserved for people. Fiona Marshall and her colleagues examined them and found joints and vertebrae worn in the pattern of animals that had carried heavy loads for years. Their skeletons still looked like wild asses. So here were working animals, valuable enough to be buried at a king's tomb, whose bodies had not yet finished becoming donkeys. Domestication is slow enough that you can catch it mid-sentence. Here's the detail that ruins the comfortable explanation. The African wild ass is not a gentle animal. It is still out there, critically endangered, in the deserts of Eritrea and Ethiopia and Somalia, and the people who work with it describe an animal that kicks, bites, and does not care for human company at all. Its social structure is loose. It scatters. If temperament alone decided these things, the donkey should not exist either. Which brings us to the explanation almost everyone has heard. Jared Diamond popularized it. A list of obstacles, any one of which is enough to sink a species. Diet too costly, growth too slow. Won't breed in captivity. Nasty disposition, panics too easily. Wrong social structure. He called it the Anna Karenina principle, after the line about happy families, and applied it to zebras with the phrase, incurably vicious disposition. It is a satisfying list. It has also gone almost untested for 30 years, which is a strange thing for an idea that appears in every article on this topic. In 2024, a group at the University of Arizona did test it. Steckless and colleagues, publishing in the journal Animals, took 65 hoof species, built an evolutionary tree, and asked which of the proposed traits actually predicts whether a species got domesticated. Body mass, no relationship. Dietary flexibility, no relationship. Gregariousness, the herd animal trait that appears on every version of the list, no relationship. One variable came out significant, and it was not temperament in the way people usually mean it. Capture myopathy, the name is unhelpful, so here's what it describes. A wild animal is chased, cornered, netted, or restrained. Its body does what evolution built it to do under a lion, which is to spend everything at once. Muscle burns itself past the point of repair. The chemistry of the blood turns against the animal, the heart muscle takes damage, and the kidneys can fail trying to clear the wreckage. The animal may be released, walk away, and die 2 days later without a scratch on it. Vets on capture operations have been managing this problem for decades. In a review of the condition across hoofed animals, Daniel Blumstein and colleagues found that vulnerability to it tracks running speed, longevity, brain size, and group living, which together read as the profile of a species that has spent a very long time being hunted. That points somewhere specific. At the end of the last ice age, northern Eurasia lost most of its large predators. Africa did not. Africa kept lions, hyenas, wild dogs, leopards, and an unbroken run of hominins, hunting the same herds for 1 million years and more. The Arizona team's reading is that horses and wild asses in the north relaxed out of the extreme stress response once the pressure came off. while zebras, still living inside the full predator guild, kept it. The horse can be caught and it hates it, and it survives it. The zebra can be caught and something in it may not stop running afterwards. I want to be careful about how strong that claim is. It comes from comparative modeling across species, not from an excavation or a controlled trial, and the authors describe it as a tentative reconstruction to be tested by further work. Their own model explains about a fifth of the variation. It is the best empirical answer currently on the table, and it is still a first pass. What it does do is finish off the folk version. You will read almost everywhere that zebras were never domesticated because they lack a social hierarchy. That claim does not survive contact with the field data. Plain zebras live in harems led by a stallion, which is the same arrangement feral horses use. Gravy zebras hold territories and move in fluid groups, which is roughly what the African wild ass does, and the wild ass became the donkey. The same 2284 paper reviews the social systems of every living equid and concludes they are not substantially different from one another. I went looking for a study comparing aggression in zebras and horses under matched conditions, and I could not find one. The vicious disposition line, repeated for a quarter of a century, rests mostly on the impressions of people handling wild-caught adults. The same goes for the details that get passed around with it, that a zebra bites and will not let go, that it has a ducking reflex which makes it almost impossible to catch with a rope, that zebras put more zookeepers in hospital than tigers do. Those come from anecdote and from keepers' war stories, not from any study I could locate. They may well be true. They are not evidence in the sense that the word usually means. The stranger part of this is what happened when people had every reason in the world to succeed, and money and a state behind them. Now, the part of the story where the incentive was overwhelming, and it still did not happen. Across huge stretches of Africa, horses and mules died. The killer was trypanosomiasis, a parasitic disease carried by the tsetse fly, and it made horse-powered transport impossible in exactly the regions colonial administrations most wanted to move goods through. The disease has not gone anywhere. Current estimates put its cost at around 3 million cattle deaths a year and billions of dollars of lost agricultural output across sub-Saharan Africa, and there is still no vaccine. Zebras are resistant to it. So the arithmetic looked obvious from London and Berlin. Here is an equid already living on the ground you are trying to cross, immune to the thing that kills your imported animals. Governments funded the attempts. Armies ran them. In German East Africa, officers rode zebras and bred them to horses in the hope of getting disease resistance in an animal with a horse's nerves. Picture a station yard around 1905. A young zebra, caught as a foal, has been in harness for weeks and is pulling a cart between two mules well enough that nobody is watching closely anymore. Then something goes over in the yard, a crate or a bucket, and the animal is gone in the direction away from the noise with the cart still attached. The verdicts recorded from that period are consistent and unromantic. Zebras broke to harness readily enough. They had less endurance than mules. They panicked more easily. And some of the animals that fought hardest during capture were dead within days of arriving for no reason anyone could see. Notice what nobody did. Nobody ran a breeding program. Compare it with the one serious modern attempt at making a new domestic animal. In 1959, at Novosibirsk in Siberia, the geneticist Dmitry Belyaev started selecting silver foxes on a single criterion, tameness toward humans, and Lyudmila Trut has run that project for most of the time since. Within about 10 generations, the foxes were dramatically changed. Floppy ears, patchy coats, animals that sought out human company. That result comes with a live dispute. In 2019, Catherine Lord, Eleanor Carlson, Gregor Larson, and their co-authors argued in Trends in Ecology and Evolution that Belyaev's founding animals came from Canadian fur farms with decades of breeding behind them, so the changes were not starting from wild stock. Trut disputes that reading. Either way, the relevant number is the one nobody argues about. That program has run for more than 60 years, backed by a state institute with records kept on every animal. The colonial zebra experiments ran for a season or two on individual animals with no records, aimed at getting a cart moved this year. So here's the twist, and it has two halves. The zebra carries a body that treats capture the way it treats a lion, and that raises the cost of every single step of the process. But it also never faced a proper attempt, because nobody ever needed one. Africa already had the donkey by 5000 BC, and later had camels and cattle, and wherever the flies allowed, imported horses. A domestication program is a 200-year investment with no return for the person who starts it. The zebra was never tested and found wanting. The test was never run because a cheaper animal was already standing in the yard. Whether the outcome would have been different is genuinely unresolved. My own reading is that a zebra could probably be domesticated by a modern program with a century of patience, and that this would prove almost nothing except that we can do it, which is why nobody has funded it. Someone who knows equids better than I do could argue the opposite from the capture myopathy evidence and would not be being unreasonable. The wider pattern is easy to check. Almost every animal in a farmyard was domesticated by people who had no idea they were doing it. Over spans of time, longer than any empire. The exceptions are recent and industrial. Ostriches were farmed from the 1860s. Mink and silver foxes came in the 20th century. Atlantic salmon were pulled into organized breeding programs in Norway in the 1970s and changed fast, because a hatchery can raise millions of animals and select the best of them every few years. That is the machinery domestication actually needs, not a stable, a spreadsheet spanning generations. And there is one case where somebody did point that machinery at a zebra. In 1984, the quagga became the first extinct animal to have its DNA analyzed from a skin in a Cape Town museum, and the result showed it had been a subspecies of the plains zebra rather than a separate species. Its coloring was still out there, scattered through living animals. So in 1987, Reinhold Rau started a breeding program in South Africa, selecting plains zebras for reduced striping at the rear and a browner coat, generation after generation. Roughly 30 years and 5 generations later, the project had foals that looked convincingly like the animal in the 1883 photographs. Coat pattern is a far simpler target than temperament, and the animals produced are no tamer than any other zebra. The program still proves the ordinary point that the colonial experiments never tested. Zebras breed under human management, and their offspring change in the direction you select, if you are willing to spend decades. Meanwhile, the relationship with the zebra has quietly inverted. There are fewer than 3,000 Gravy's zebras left. We do not try to break them now. We count them, collar them, and argue about grazing rights on their behalf. And the hybrids, the Zorsies and Zonkies that colonists hoped would combine the best of both animals are almost always sterile, like mules. A shortcut that cannot produce a second generation is not a shortcut to anything. So which is it? An animal that cannot be domesticated or an animal that nobody ever needed enough to try properly? The evidence leans toward the body, toward a stress response tuned by a million years of lions. The history leans toward the donkey standing there already, cheap and adequate, and asking nothing. The experiment that would settle it would take 3 centuries, and it would have to begin with somebody deciding the answer was worth knowing.